Hi there and welcome back. Here with Terry, and today I'm going to be planting a forest using these Japanese maples along with this forest container. Now, one of the things that you're going to need is a container, a shallow container like this one, to plant your forest into. You need something that is very shallow because it represents the landscape that the trees or the forest is on. You don't want something too deep. Also, shallow containers actually retain a tremendous amount more water than deeper containers. And usually you have a lot of trees with a lot of moisture requirement, especially with Japanese maples. They do like a little bit of water. And so it's actually beneficial to have them in a shallower container for that purpose as well. And glazed is preferable. It's not only an aesthetic consideration, it is also from a cultivation point of view, in the sense that glazed containers retain more water as well than unglazed containers, because moisture can of course move through the walls of the container, and so in other words, dry out the media faster that way. Now, of course, you're also going to need an assortment of plants. I'm using Japanese maples, but of course you can use, to plant a forest in general, you can use any species really. I've selected from a nursery a whole bunch of trees, so that I have a variety. It's important that if you're going to plant a forest, that you have a variety of trees to choose from, because you're not necessarily going to use all of them. Some of them might be better suited in specific positions in the forest, in the foreground, in the background, on the side, because of the trunk girth or the side, the height, or maybe a certain movement in the trunk as well that maybe makes it better suited to a certain position. So it's important that you have a choice of material, and the ideal time to plant this forest, of course, will be, if you're using deciduous material, would be at this point in time, which is when buds are swelling and leaves are just coming out. You get many different kinds of forests or forest styles. So you get, for instance, you get a near view or a close-up view type of forest, which is where you're trying to represent the view that you would have if you were very close up to a forest. And so you would you would select material in a way that you have a variety of thick and thin trees, so that you can enhance this sense of depth. But then you also have a distant view of a forest as well, which is where in nature perhaps you're standing a few kilometers away from a forest and viewing it in that way. So then the trunks the differences in the thickness of the trunks, although in the forest itself obviously you would have trunks of a variety of thicknesses, but when you're looking at them from a distance, very often they tend to blend and they all start looking the same. And so with a distant view forest, the image that you're trying to portray is really the outline of the forest. And it's a distant view forest that I'm going to be creating with this material that I have selected. If you haven't yet planted a forest, I would strongly suggest that you try one. What is one of the wonderful things about planting and having a forest in your collection is that when obviously bonsai generally is on individual trees, or you're using a solitary tree in your composition with the container, and obviously that is completely different to a forest where you might be using 5, 13, 20, 30 odd trees, or whatever the quantity is, depending on how big the forest is. So there's obviously the difference is that you're using far more material. And what this makes possible then is that instead of having to have one good tree, you can have many trees of mediocre quality that collectively produce a far more impactful image. And so in fact you can use, well, I mean, obviously better forests. You would find, particularly those on exhibition in Japan and elsewhere in the world, that the best forests, the material that is used for that is grown for a forest. So the material is actually prepared. So it's not necessarily just, oh, I have this material, what can I use it for? Let's make a forest with it. But if you have such material that is maybe mediocre and that is going to take many years to develop as an individual tree with some impact, you can then use that material if you're grouping it together, and the collective essentially produces a very convincing forest, and one that leaves the viewer with real impact. So I actually debated a lot about whether I wanted to do this demonstration for you or not. The reason for my reluctance was the fact that these trees, most of them have already leafed out quite extensively, and I would say that it's getting a little bit risky to the material, because obviously there's going to be some root work that is required, and as a result the leaves will not have the amount of moisture provided to them that they would in their current condition, you know, with the roots untouched. But I decided to go ahead and do it anyway. I will obviously have to protect the material or the planting afterwards very, very well. It'll go into the greenhouse with where it'll be misted frequently throughout the day. And but so just be aware that this is actually a little bit late. Ideally, you should get this, do this planting in the very early spring, before the leaves have developed to this point. Ideally when the buds are just swelling, that would be the best time to do it. So I do caution you, be careful, do as I say, don't do as I do, but I hope that you can still learn something from the demonstration. So to start off with, I'm going to prepare the container, because that is going to take a little bit of time. First want to make sure that I've got drainage mesh covering the holes so that I don't lose any of my growing media, and as usual, make sure that the wire that you're using is not going to rust away. So ideally use something like aluminium wire, and then also make sure that that there's not going to be any movement. The wire should fit snugly inside the hole, so that the mesh is not going to move around, because that might allow some media to slip through around the sides. And then you're taking some plastic drainage mesh and just cutting that a little bit smaller so that it comfortably fits over the holes. But you don't want it too big, because otherwise media can get underneath it again, and then it sort of gets in the way. So just push this through, and then on the other side we're going to just anchor that in place. And you can, there's many different ways of doing this, of course. This is just one method. I like to put a little bit of a Z in the shape. That seems to secure it nicely so it doesn't move. And we're going to do that on the other side as well. And just give that wire a bend, and to the opposite side. And if it's a little bit too long, you can just cut that a bit shorter as you prefer. Now that's our holes covered. Now the next step is quite important, because obviously, as you can imagine, we've got this large surface, and we're going to have 20 odd trees, all with very small reduced root balls. And of course, these two wires that we have already in the container have been provided to for wire to tie down the trees. But of course, those 2 or 4 holes is not going to be sufficient. And so what I'm going to show you now is how to build a little lattice work, a little framework. These are bamboo skewers for making kebabs on. But you can use any material really that's suitable. But I wouldn't You could use wire, I suppose, but this is just easy, and it also allows you to cut it to the specific length that you would need. And so we're going to build a little framework which is going to allow us to attach many pieces of wire onto so that we can secure the trees in position. It's very annoying if you have a tree that is just not balancing by itself and keeps on moving around, and of course any wind or any external force could bump the trees over, and that could either kill the tree or at least set it back. So it's best to secure the trees in place, and this is the ideal method for doing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use probably I'll use two of the thicker sticks for a cross piece, and I'm going to cut them shorter with a branch cutter, and this is just to get them to fit into the container. So they will form the first ribs, and then I'm going to have a series of these spaced, I don't know, these are a few centimeters, 2-3 centimeters apart, really just as you wish. I'm just going to cut these sharp points off, and I don't think I'm going to need to go all the way to the edge of the container anyway. And so I'm going to start with this length, and then I'm going to go with a shorter one on the sides, and just cut another one the same length as that, and that will be my framework. Okay, now I'm going to secure the skewers together. I'm using a little piece of aluminium wire for that. And my pliers. And then I'll just follow on with the other pieces. The lattice work is now completed, and now I'm just going to skew this into the container. And now the pot is prepared, and so we can move on to the next step. Now I'm going to take these maples outside, and I'm going to rinse off the soil that they're growing in currently with a strong jet of water. This will be probably the most gentle on the tree to use water instead of tools. I've now washed the roots of the maples, and I'm now going to start with the planting. So unlike a normal, let's call it a typical forest planting, where you would arrange individual groups of trees and trying to vary the differences in thickness of trunks, with this planting, it's really, as I mentioned earlier on, about the overall, or the overall shape of the forest. And so what I've done is I have arranged my trunks, or the trees that I have, in a kind of a system of the thickest and tallest trunks, which I will use. If you imagine looking at the planting from the top down, those trees will be on the center, and then I will use smaller trees on the outline. Because these trees would generally, in nature, the smaller trees would be lower down or shorter and smaller, because they're being exposed to more of the elements, whereas the trees that are growing deeper into the forest would of course have to grow taller in order to get sunlight, and they would be more sheltered, so they would also be stronger. They have better access to water and nutrients as a result of the shade of neighboring trees. So that's the way I'm doing it. So what I'm saying is, it's not really important how you arrange the trees, but just generally my approach is going to be that I will use thicker trees, taller trees in the center, and also this is still having a front which is in this direction, and so the trees should have, if anything, have a slight curve to to the front. And now now the lattice work is really going to become important, because now we have a lot of flexibility with where we place these trees and being able to anchor them at those particular positions. So that's the first tree anchored, and as you can see, it stands perfectly fine on its own without any further assistance other than the wire that was used to anchor it into position. Now I should add that you also don't want trunks to, when viewed from the front, you don't want them crossing one another. So you're obviously seeing a side view. So you wouldn't want this kind of thing happening, trunks crisscrossing. And you also want there to be a general flow from left to right, so it'll be slightly shaped like a fan. So these trees will be facing, tilting this way, and on the other side they will be moving in more in that direction again. So I've now finished planting the forest, and the next step will be to work some growing medium into the pot and amongst the roots. Make sure that there are no air pockets or gaps, areas where media is missing, because the roots obviously won't develop in those areas. So I'm going to be using a fine akadama. It's better suited to this sort of scale of planting. It's not mixed with anything else, so it's just pure akadama, and this is going to give me good water retention. For the moment, I'm not too worried about the exact positioning of the trees, because I have left the wires slightly loose so that I can still slide the trees to the left, to the right, and also a little bit forward and back. So you need to be careful when you're positioning the trees. The lattice work obviously is in a grid sort of fashion. You don't want to lay your trees out in a grid fashion, because that going to look a bit like a forestry planting, like a grove of plantation trees or something. That's not what you want. So you do need to try and move the trees, grip, with the wire, grip the roots in such a way that it gives you a little bit of forward and back movement, so that you don't have the trees all in the same position when the forest is viewed from the front to the back, and obviously also from the front, from the left and to the right, that the trees also are spaced in an interesting sort of manner. So you're looking very much at the negative spacing between the trees as well. So now when you start chopsticking the soil in, this is when you really need to start paying attention to the angles, because you can use the soil to help you position the trees slightly as well. But you can make those adjustments as you're chopsticking the soil in, because the weight of the soil also does help to keep the trees in position. The wires do the bulk of the work, that's why they're there, but the soil itself also does add some integrity. I've now finished chopsticking the soil into the root system, and I'm now going to go and give the planting a very good and thorough watering and allowing the water to run through the drainage holes until it runs clear. Then that means that the dust, if whatever dust remains in the media has been washed out of the container. Then I'll bring it back in, and just one final step, and then we're done. Final thing that I want to do is just to sprinkle some sphagnum moss on. Now this is grated sphagnum moss, and it's used as a top dressing, and it's I have got a video that I'll link to explaining how it's made. Normally I would be applying this wet. This is just moist. It's just going to make it easier for me to get it into the in between the trees, and then it'll be watered again afterwards, just to flatten it down and get it, otherwise it can blow away. Well, there's no wind today, but yeah, if it's breezy, then you might lose some of it as well. This is just going to help to keep moisture in the area of soil at the top of the tree, or at the top of the planting, moist. It will encourage the formation of surface roots, and also act, very importantly, as a means to stabilize the soil, because at the moment the soil is quite is very loose, and so when you're watering, depending on how you water, the soil can easily shift around, and this is just going to create a little bit of a layer to keep it from doing that. And that brings me to the end of today's video. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope that you feel inspired to do something similar. And in fact, I also wanted to mention that the easiest way to grow a a distant view forest like this one is actually to grow it from seed. So instead of using young plants like I have, you would actually just sow a whole lot of seeds in a container, and then you'd be able to get them extremely close to one another, and wouldn't have to go to all the trouble that I did in order to secure them into position and working the media in and everything around it. But this is the way that I used it. This is the material that I had available to use, and I think it's going to be a very pleasing planting, and will only improve with age. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope that if you haven't done so already, please do like and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification bell as well, and then you'll be notified when I upload the next video, which is usually every Friday afternoon. So thanks very much for joining me, and until next time, take care and goodbye.